I went to New Orleans for research, which is how I justify most of my bad ideas. On paper, it was simple and respectable. I was tracing the evolution of vampire folklore in the American South. Specifically how European legends mutated once they hit a city already saturated with death, ritual, and humidity thick enough to feel alive. New Orleans isn't just a setting for vampire stories. It's a collaborator. I told myself this as the plane descended, watching the wetlands spread out like dark veins beneath the clouds. I wasn't there to chase thrills, and I wasn't there to provoke anything. I was there to understand why this city, more than anywhere else in the United States, insists on vampires not as monsters, but as residents. Before we get into the story, I'm Devin, and this is Porch Lore. Please be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and help me reach 5,000 subscribers. Enjoy the story. This is Porch Lore. And I'm your host, Devin. This is the tale of the New Orleans vampires. From the start, the research didn't behave the way it should have. Most folklore trips follow a familiar pattern. You read the academic sources, then the local retellings, and then the exaggerated tourist versions, and somewhere in the overlap, you find the truth hiding quietly. New Orleans didn't offer overlap. It offered layers, and each layer contradicted the last, while insisting it was the original. The French Quarter vampire narratives were the most well-known, of course. Stories tied to the Ursuline convent. The so-called casket girls. European women arriving with coffin-shaped trunks that allegedly contained soil from their homeland. Or worse. Historians are quick to dismiss the vampire angle, and rightly so. The trunks were practical. The myths came later. Except the myths didn't behave like retroactive inventions. They behaved like edits. Every early account I found had marginal notes, scratched out lines, revisions made by different hands, dates corrected and names removed. Entire paragraphs missing, as if someone had decided that certain details aged poorly and needed to be retired. The more obscure the source, the more intact the story. By the third day, I had narrowed my focus to a cluster of accounts centered around the lower quarter and the stretch of streets edging toward Marigny. These stories didn't frame vampires as predators. They framed them as caretakers, watchers, things that stayed behind when everyone else fled. Especially during outbreaks, fires, and floods. There was an old phrase that kept repeating across decades of material, always untranslated and always assumed to be a metaphor. Les veilleurs du sang, watchers of the blood. I stayed in a narrow, creaking guest house that predated most of the street's wiring. The kind of place where the floor slopes gently toward history and the mirrors feel a little too honest. I chose it because several of the earliest accounts referenced a boarding house on the same block, though the name had changed at least 4 times. The first oddity was architectural. My room had no threshold. And I don't mean a lack of a door frame. I mean there was no raised sill, no lip. No transition between hallway and room. Just a continuous stretch of warped wood polished smooth by time. It struck me as strange because old buildings usually exaggerated boundaries. They don't erase them. I made a note of it and then I forgot about it. That night I organized my materials, spreading photocopies and notebooks across the bed. Many of the older stories described an informal system of permission. Residents didn't invite vampires inside their homes, they acknowledged them. Left doors ajar. Removed locks during epidemics. The implication was subtle but consistent. Invitation wasn't verbal. It was architectural. The second oddity came the next morning. I woke with a distinct sensation that someone had been standing beside the bed for a long time and had only just left. Not fear exactly, more like the way you feel when a conversation ends without you realizing it had even started. My notes had been rearranged, not missing, not damaged, simply reorganized, by street instead of by year. What bothered me wasn't the intrusion, it was the competence. Whoever did it understood the material. I told myself it was the owner, or housekeeping, or maybe my own tired brain. The explanation lasted until I noticed the addition. At the top of one page, written in a careful, old-fashioned hand that was not mine, was a date. Not a future warning and not a threat. A correction. I spent the afternoon walking. New Orleans encourages walking because it wants you tired. Slower. More permeable. The city teaches you where to step and where not to linger. I followed the path of the older stories, noting which buildings were repeatedly spared during disasters. Fires that jumped entire blocks but stopped short of certain doors. Flood lines that curved strangely around specific courtyards. Every one of those buildings shared something subtle and common. They all lacked thresholds. No raised sills, no symbolic barriers. Doors that met the street directly, as if the house and the city had agreed not to pretend they were separate things. That night I stayed up late reading first-hand accounts from the early 1900s. One written by a night physician during a yellow fever outbreak described men who never slept and never aged, who moved patients from bed to bed and who carried the dying into the street so the illness wouldn't linger indoors. He never used the word vampire. Instead, he used the word neighbor. Sometime after midnight, I became aware of movement in the room. Not footsteps, not sound. It was the absence of the city's constant noise, like someone had cupped their hands over the night. I laid still, my heart steady but alert, watching the dark. Figures stood along the walls, not shadows, not illusions, people. Solid, precise, dressed in styles that didn't belong to the same decade, let alone the same room. Their faces were calm and focused, almost bored. None of them crossed onto the bed. And that was when I noticed it again. The missing threshold. The way my room bled directly into the hall, and the hallway into the stairs, and the stairs into the street. There was no moment where entry became intrusion. They weren't trespassing. They were just present. Understanding settled slowly, the way a fever breaks. The watchers weren't invited into homes. Homes were built, so they never had to be. New Orleans hadn't survived because it was lucky, or resilient, or spiritually protected. It survived because it made room for what refused to leave. Because when death came too often, the city negotiated. The figures began to move, not toward me, but around me. Adjusting the placement of my notes, correcting dates, and removing names that should not be spoken anymore. I realized then that none of the older accounts were censored by institutions. They were edited by participants. One figure paused beside the bed, close enough that I could see details. The skin was wrong, not decayed, but preserved, like something kept in cool darkness for centuries. Their eyes met mine briefly, not predatory, not curious, just evaluating. I understood what was being decided. I hadn't been researching vampires. I had been auditing a system. The Watchers of the Blood were not hunters. They were infrastructure. When disease came, they carried it away. When violence surged, they redirected it. And when dead overflowed, they thinned the threshold between life and after so the city wouldn't drown in its own loss. After a few decades, someone like me came along and started noticing patterns that they weren't supposed to notice. The figure reached down and placed something on the nightstand. A small, brittle card. a guest registry entry from the boarding house that once stood here. My name was already written on it, dated 3 days before my arrival. Below it, another name had been crossed out. Someone else had planned this research, and they had not left New Orleans. The figures receded, not vanishing, simply redistributing themselves back into the city's bones. And then the sound returned. Traffic, laughter, a distant trumpet playing something slow and unhurried. In the morning, my notes were intact, but altered. Certain connections no longer made sense, and certain conclusions refused to form. The material that remained was safe, publishable, toothless. I checked out early. At the airport while waiting to board, I searched for the name on the registry that had been crossed out. It appeared exactly once in public records. Cause of death listed as relocation complications. No body was ever recovered. I still research folklore, and I still travel for it. But I understand the rule now, the one New Orleans never bothers to explain. Some cities don't have vampire legends because they fear them. They have them because they rely on them. And if you notice too much, the city doesn't chase you away. It just edits you out. I'm Devin, and thanks for joining me, Porch Pals. For more stories like this, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and help me reach 5,000 subscribers. And remember, there's always room for one more on the porch.